Preface and Chapter 1, Part 1 of Miss Mapp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Kara Schallenberg. Miss Mapp by E. F. Benson. Preface and Chapter 1, Part 1. Preface. I lingered at the window of the garden room from which Miss Mapp so often and so ominously looked forth. To the left was the front of her house, straight ahead the steep cobbled way with a glimpse of the High Street at the end, to the right the crooked chimney and the church. The street was populous with passengers, but search as I might, I could see none who ever so remotely resembled the objects of her vigilance. E. F. Benson. Lamb House, Rye. Chapter 1, Part 1. Miss Elizabeth Mapp might have been 40, and she had taken advantage of this opportunity by being just a year or two older. Her face was of high, vivid colour, and was corrugated by chronic rage and curiosity, but these vivifying emotions had preserved to her an astonishing activity of mind and body, which fully accounted for the comparative adolescence with which she would have been credited anywhere except in the charming little town which she had inhabited so long. Anger and the gravest suspicions about everybody had kept her young and on the boil. She sat on this hot July morning like a large bird of prey at the very convenient window of her garden room, the ample bow of which formed a strategical point of high value. This garden room, solid and spacious, was built at right angles to the front of her house, and looked straight down the very interesting street which debouched at its lower end into the High Street of Tilling. Exactly opposite her front door the road turned sharply, so that as she looked out from this projecting window, her own house was at right angles on her left, the street in question plunged steeply downwards in front of her, and to her right she commanded an uninterrupted view of its further course, which terminated in the disused graveyard surrounding the big Norman church. Anything of interest about the church, however, could be gleaned from a guide-book, and Miss Mapp did not occupy herself much with such coldly venerable topics. Far more to her mind was the fact that between the church and her strategic window was the cottage in which her gardener lived, and she could thus see, when not otherwise engaged, whether he went home before 12 or failed to get back to her garden again by 1, for he had to cross the street in front of her very eyes. Similarly, she could observe whether any of his abandoned family ever came out from her garden door weighted with suspicious baskets, which might contain smuggled vegetables. Only yesterday morning she had hurried forth with a dangerous smile to intercept a laden urchin with inquiries as to what was in "that nice basket." On that occasion that nice basket had proved to contain a strawberry net, which was being sent for repair to the gardener's wife, so there was nothing more to be done except verify its return. This she did from a side window of the garden room which commanded the strawberry beds. She could sit quite close to that, for it was screened by the large-leaved branches of a fig-tree, and she could spy unseen. Otherwise, this road to the right leading up to the church was of no great importance, except on Sunday morning, when she could get a practically complete list of those who attended divine service, for no one of real interest lived in the humble dwellings which lined it. To the left was the front of her own house at right angles to the strategic window, and with regard to that a good many useful observations might be, and were, made. She could, from behind a curtain, negligently half drawn across the side of the window nearest the house, have an eye on her housemaid at work, and notice if she leaned out of a window, or made remarks to a friend passing in the street, or waved salutations with a duster. Swift upon such discoveries, she would execute a flank march across the few steps of garden, and steal into the house, noiselessly ascend the stairs, and catch the offender red-handed at this public dalliance. But all such domestic espionage to right and left was flavourless and insipid compared to the tremendous discoveries which daily and hourly awaited the trained observer of the street that lay directly in front of her window. There was little that concerned the social movements of Tilling that could not be proved, or at least reasonably conjectured, from Miss Mapp's eyrie. Just below her house on the left stood Major Flint's residence, of Georgian red brick like her own, and opposite was that of Captain Puffin. They were both bachelors, though Major Flint was generally supposed to have been the hero of some amazingly amorous adventures in early life, and always turned the subject with great abruptness when anything connected with duelling was mentioned. It was not, therefore, unreasonable to infer that he had had experiences of a bloody sort, and colour was added to this romantic conjecture by the fact that in damp, rheumatic weather his left arm was very stiff, and he had been known to say that his wound troubled him. What wound that was, no one exactly knew. It might have been anything from a vaccination mark to a sabre cut, for having said that his wound troubled him, he would invariably add, "Pshaw, that's enough about an old campaigner," and though he might subsequently talk of nothing else except the old campaigner, he drew a veil over his old campaigns. That he had been in service in India was, indeed, probable by his referring to lunch as tiffin, and calling to his parlour-maid with the ejaculation of "Ki hi!" As her name was Sarah, this was clearly a reminiscence of days in bungalows. When not in a rage, his manner to his own sex was bluff and hearty, but whether in a rage or not, his manner to the fairies, or lovely woman, was gallant and pompous in the extreme. He certainly had a lock of hair in a small gold specimen case on his watch-chain, and had been seen to kiss it when, rather carelessly, he thought that he was unobserved. Miss Mapp's eye, as she took her seat in her window on this sunny July morning, lingered for a moment on the Major's house before she proceeded to give a disgusted glance at the pictures on the back page of her morning illustrated paper, which chiefly represented young women dancing in rings in the surf or lying on the beach, in attitudes which Miss Mapp would have scorned to adjust herself to. Neither the Major nor Captain Puffin were very early risers, but it was about time that the first signals of animation might be expected. Indeed, at this moment she quite distinctly heard the muffled roar, which to her experienced ear was easily interpreted to be "Ki hi!" "So the Major has just come down to breakfast," she mechanically inferred, "and it's close on 10 o'clock. Let me see. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, porridge morning." Her penetrating glance shifted to the house exactly opposite to that in which it was porridge morning, and even as she looked a hand was thrust out of a small upper window and deposited a sponge on the sill. Then from the inside the lower sash was thrust firmly down, so as to prevent the sponge from blowing away and falling into the street. Captain Puffin, it was therefore clear, was a little later than the Major that morning, but he always shaved and brushed his teeth before his bath, so that there was but a few minutes between them. General manoeuvres in Tilling, the gradual burstings of fluttering life from the chrysalis of the night, the emergence of the ladies of the town with their wicker baskets in their hands for housekeeping purchases, the exodus of men to catch the 11:20 a.m. steam tram out to the golf links, and other first steps in the duties and diversions of the day, did not get into full swing till 10:30, and Miss Mapp had ample time to skim the headlines of her paper and indulge in chaste meditations about the occupants of these two houses, before she need really make herself alert to miss nothing. Of the two, Major Flint, without doubt, was the more attractive to the feminine sense. For years Miss Mapp had tried to cajole him into marrying her, and had not nearly finished yet. With his record of adventure, with the romantic reek of India and camphor in the tiger skin of the rugs that strewed his hall and surged like a rising tide up the wall, with his haughty and gallant manner, with his loud pshawings and sniffs at nonsense and balderdash, his thumpings on the table to emphasize an argument, with his wound and his prodigious swipes at golf, his intolerance of any who believed in ghosts, microbes, or vegetarianism, there was something dashing and risky about him. You felt that you were in the presence of some hot coal straight from the furnace of creation. Captain Puffin, on the other hand, was of clay so different that he could hardly be considered to be made of clay at all. He was lame and short and meagre, with strings of peaceful beads and Papuan aprons in his hall, instead of wild tiger-skins, and had a jerky, inattentive manner and a high-pitched voice. Yet to Miss Mapp's mind there was something behind his unimpressiveness that had a mysterious quality, all the more so because nothing of it appeared on the surface. Nobody could call Major Flint, with his bawlings and his sniffings, the least mysterious. He laid all his loud cards on the table, great hulking kings and aces. But Miss Mapp felt far from sure that Captain Puffin did not hold a joker which would some time come to light. The idea of being Mrs. Puffin was not so attractive as the other, but she occasionally gave it her remote consideration. Yet there was mystery about them both, in spite of the fact that most of their movements were so amply accounted for. As a rule, they played golf together in the morning, reposed in the afternoon, as could easily be verified by anyone standing on a still day in the road between their houses, and listening to the loud and rhythmical breathings that fanned the tranquil air. Certainly went out to tea-parties afterwards and played bridge till dinner-time, or if no such entertainment was proffered them, occupied arm-chairs at the country club, or laboriously amassed 100 at billiards. Though tea-parties were profuse, dining out was very rare at Tilling. Patience, or a jigsaw puzzle occupied the hour or two that intervened between domestic supper and bedtime, but again and again Miss Mapp had seen lights burning in the sitting-room of those two neighbours, at an hour when such lights as were still in evidence at Tilling were strictly confined to bedrooms, and should, indeed, have been extinguished there. And only last week, being plucked from slumber by some unaccountable indigestion, for which she blamed a small green apple, she had seen at no less than 12:30 in the morning the lights in Captain Puffin's sitting-room still shining through the blind. This had excited her so much that at risk of toppling into the street, she had craned her neck from her window and observed a similar illumination in the house of Major Flint. They were not together, then, for in that case any prudent householder, and God knew that they both of them scraped and saved enough, or if he didn't know, Miss Mapp did, would have quenched his own lights if he were talking to his friend in his friend's house. The next night, the pangs of indigestion having completely vanished, she set her alarm clock at the same timeless hour, and had observed exactly the same phenomenon. Such late hours, of course, amply accounted for these late breakfasts, but why, so Miss Mapp pithily asked herself, why these late hours? Of course they both kept summer time, whereas most of Tilling utterly refused, except when going by train, to alter their watches because Mr. Lloyd George told them to. But even allowing for that, then she perceived that summer time made it later than ever for its adherents, so that was no excuse. Miss Mapp had a mind that was incapable of believing the improbable, and the current explanation of these late hours was very improbable indeed. Major Flint often told the world in general that he was revising his diaries, and that the only uninterrupted time which he could find in this pleasant whirl of life at Tilling was when he was alone in the evening. Captain Puffin, on his part, confessed to a student's curiosity about the ancient history of Tilling, with regard to which he was preparing a monograph. He could talk, when permitted, by the hour about the reclamation from the sea of the marshland south of the town, and about the old Roman road which was built on a raised causeway, of which traces remained, But it argued, so thought Miss Mapp, an unprecedented egoism on the part of Major Flint, and an equally unprecedented love of antiquities on the part of Captain Puffin, that they should prosecute their studies, with gas at the present price, till such hours. No, Miss Mapp knew better than that, but she had not made up her mind exactly what it was that she knew. She mentally rejected the idea that egoism, even in these days of diaries and autobiographies, and antiquities accounted for so much study, with the same healthy intolerance with which a vigorous stomach rejects unwholesome food, and did not allow herself to be insidiously poisoned by its retention. But as she took up her light aluminum opera-glasses to make sure whether it was Isabel Poppet or not who was now stepping with that high, prancing tread into the stationer's in the High Street, she exclaimed to herself, for the 365th time after breakfast, "It's very baffling," for it was precisely a year to-day since she had first seen those mysterious midnight squares of illuminated blind. Baffling, in fact, was a word that constantly made short appearances in Miss Mapp's vocabulary, though its retention for a whole year over one subject was unprecedented. But never yet had baffled sullied her wells of pure undefiled English. Movement had begun. Mrs. Plaistow, carrying her wicker basket, came round the corner by the church, in the direction of Miss Mapp's window, and as there was a temporary coolness between them, following violent heat, with regard to some worsted of brilliant rose madder hue, which a forgetful draper had sold to Mrs. Plaistow, having definitely promised it to Miss Mapp. But Miss Mapp's large-mindedness scorned to recall the sordid details of this paltry appropriation. The heat had quite subsided, and Miss Mapp was, for her part, quite prepared to let the coolness regain the normal temperature of cordiality the moment that Mrs. Plaistow returned that worsted. Outwardly and publicly friendly relationships had been resumed, and as the coolness had lasted 6 weeks or so, it was probable that the worsted had already been incorporated into the ornamental border of Mrs. Plaistow's jumper or winter scarf, and a proper expression of regret would have to do instead. So the nearer Mrs. Plaistow approached, the more invisible she became to Miss Mapp's eye, and when she was within saluting distance had vanished altogether. Simultaneously Miss Poppet came out of the stationer's in the High Street. Mrs. Plaistow turned the corner below Miss Mapp's window and went bobbing along down the steep hill. She walked with the motion of those mechanical dolls sold in the street, which have 3 legs set as spokes to a circle, so that their feet emerge from their dress with Dutch and rigid regularity, and her figure had a certain squat rotundity that suited her gait. She distinctly looked into Captain Puffin's dining-room window as she passed, and with the misplaced juvenility so characteristic of her, waggled her plump little hand at it. At the corner beyond Major Flint's house she hesitated a moment, and turned off down the entry into the side street where Mr. Wyse lived. The dentist lived there too, and as Mr. Wyse was away on the continent of Europe, Mrs. Plaistow was almost certain to be visiting the other. Rapidly Miss Mapp remembered that at Mrs. Bartlett's bridge party yesterday, Mrs. Plaistow had selected soft chocolates for consumption, instead of those stuffed with nougat or almonds. That furnished additional evidence for the dentist, for generally you could not get a nougat chocolate at all if Godiva Plaistow had been in the room for more than a minute or two. As she crossed the narrow cobbled roadway, with the grass growing luxuriantly between the rounded pebbles, she stumbled and recovered herself with a swift little forward run, and the circular feet twinkled with the rapidity of those of a thrush scudding over the lawn. By this time Isabel Poppet had advanced as far as the fish shop 3 doors below the turning down which Mrs. Plaistow had vanished. Her prancing progress paused there for a moment, and she waited with one knee highly elevated, like a statue of a curvetting horse, before she finally decided to pass on. But she passed no farther than the fruit shop next door, and took the 3 steps that elevated it from the street in a single prance, with her Roman nose high in the air. Presently she emerged, but with no obvious rotundity like that of a melon projecting from her basket, so that Miss Mapp could see exactly what she had purchased, and went back to the fish shop again. Surely she would not put fish on the top of fruit, and even as Miss Mapp's lucid intelligence rejected this supposition, the true solution struck her. "Ice," she said to herself, and sure enough, projecting from the top of Miss Poppet's basket when she came out was an angular peak wrapped up in paper already wet. Miss Poppet came up the street, and Miss Mapp put up her illustrated paper again, with the revolting picture of the Brighton sea nymphs turned towards the window. Peeping out behind it, she observed that Miss Poppet's basket was apparently oozing with bright venous blood, and felt certain that she had bought red currants. That, coupled with the ice, made conjecture complete. She had bought red currants slightly damaged, or they would not have oozed so speedily, in order to make that iced red currant fool of which she had so freely partaken at Miss Mapp's last bridge party. That was a very scurvy trick, for iced red currant fool was an invention of Miss Mapp's, who, when it was praised, said that she had inherited the recipe from her grandmother. But Miss Poppet had evidently entered the lists against Grandmother Mapp, and she had as evidently guessed that quite inferior fruit that was distinctly off, was undetectable when severely iced. Miss Mapp could only hope that the fruit in the basket now bobbing past her window was so much off that it had begun to ferment. Fermented red currant fool was nasty to the taste, and, if persevered in, disastrous in its effects. General unpopularity might be needed to teach Miss Poppet not to trespass on Grandmamma Mapp's preserves. Isabel Poppet lived with a flashy and condescending mother just round the corner beyond the gardener's cottage, and opposite the west end of the church. They were comparatively new inhabitants of Tilling, having settled here only 2 or 3 years ago, and Tilling had not yet quite ceased to regard them as rather suspicious characters. Suspicion smouldered, though it blazed no longer. They were certainly rich, and Miss Mapp suspected them of being profiteers. They kept a butler, of whom they were both in considerable awe, who used almost to shrug his shoulders when Mrs. Poppet gave him an order. They kept a motor car, to which Mrs. Poppet was apt to allude more frequently than would have been natural if she had always been accustomed to one, and they went to Switzerland for a month every winter, and to Scotland "for the shooting season," as Mrs. Poppet terribly remarked, every summer. This all looked very black, and though Isabel conformed to the manners of Tilling in doing household shopping every morning with her wicker basket, and buying damaged fruit for food, and in dressing in the original home-made manner indicated by good breeding and narrow incomes, Miss Mapp was sadly afraid that these habits were not the outcome of chaste and instinctive simplicity, but of the ambition to be received by the old families of Tilling as one of them. But what did a true Tillingite want with a butler and a motor car? And if these were not sufficient to cast grave doubts on the sincerity of the inhabitants of Ye Smalle House, there was still very vivid in Miss Mapp's mind that dreadful moment, undimmed by the years that had passed over it, when Mrs. Poppet broke the silence at an altogether too sumptuous lunch, by asking Mrs. Plaistow if she did not find the super-tax a grievous burden on "our little incomes." Miss Mapp had drawn in her breath sharply, as if in pain, and after a few gasps turned the conversation. Worst of all, perhaps, because more recent, was the fact that Mrs. Poppet had just received the dignity of the M.B.E., or Member of the Order of the British Empire, and put it on her cards, too, as if to keep the scandal alive. Her services in connection with the Tilling Hospital had been entirely confined to putting her motor car at its disposal when she did not want it herself, and not a single member of the Tilling Working Club, which had knitted its fingers to the bone and made enough seven-tailed bandages to reach to the moon, had been offered a similar decoration. If anyone had, she would have known what to do. A stinging letter to the Prime Minister saying that she worked not with hope of distinction, but from pure patriotism, would have certainly been Miss Mapp's rejoinder. She actually drafted the letter when Mrs. Poppet's name appeared, and diligently waded through column after column of subsequent lists, to make sure that she, the originator of the Tilling Working Club, had not been the victim of a similar insult. Mrs. Poppet was a climber, that was what she was, and Miss Mapp was obliged to confess that very nimble she had been. The butler and the motor car, so frequently at the disposal of Mrs. Poppet's friends, and the incessant lunches and teas had done their work. She had fed rather than starved Tilling into submission, and Miss Mapp felt that she alone upheld the dignity of the old families. She was positively the only old family, and a solitary spinster at that, who had not surrendered to the Poppets. Naturally, she did not carry her staunchness to the extent, so to speak, of a hunger strike, for that would be singular conduct, only worthy of Suffragettes, and she partook of the Poppets' hospitality to the fullest extent possible. But, here her principles came in, she never returned the hospitality of the member of the British Empire, though she occasionally asked Isabel to her house, and abused her soundly on all possible occasions. This spiteful retrospect passed swiftly and smoothly through Miss Mapp's mind, and did not in the least take off from the acuteness with which she observed the tide in the affairs of Tilling which, after the ebb of the night, was now flowing again, nor did it, a few minutes after Isabel's disappearance round the corner, prevent her from hearing the faint tinkle of the telephone in her own house. At that she started to her feet, but paused again at the door. She had shrewd suspicions about her servants with regard to the telephone. She was convinced, though at present she had not been able to get any evidence on the point, that both her cook and her parlour-maid used it for their own base purposes at her expense, and that their friends habitually employed it for conversation with them. And perhaps, who knows, her housemaid was the worst of the lot, for she affected an almost incredible stupidity with regard to the instrument, and pretended not to be able either to speak through it or to understand its cacklings. All that might very well be assumed in order to divert suspicion, so Miss Mapp paused by the door to let any of these delinquents get deep in conversation with her friend, a soft and stealthy advance towards the room called the morning-room, a small apartment opening out of the hall, and used chiefly for the bestowal of hats and cloaks and umbrellas, would then enable her to catch one of them red-mouthed, or at any rate to overhear fragments of conversation which would supply equally direct evidence. She had got no farther than the garden door into her house, when Withers, her parlour-maid, came out. Miss Mapp thereupon began to smile and hum a tune. Then the smile widened, and the tune stopped. "Yes, Withers," she said. "Were you looking for me?" "Yes, miss," said Withers. "Miss Poppet has just rung you up." Miss Mapp looked much surprised. "And to think that the telephone should have rung without my hearing it," she said. "I must be growing deaf, Withers, in my old age. What does Miss Poppet want?" "She hopes you will be able to go to tea this afternoon and play bridge. She expects that a few friends may look in at 3:45. End of Chapter 1, Part 1. Read by Kara Schallenberg. www.kray.org. On August 9th, 2008, in San Diego, California.
Part 2 of Miss Mapp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rachel Ellen. A flood of lurid light poured into Miss Mapp's mind. To expect that a few friends may look in was the orthodox way of announcing a regular party to which she had not been asked, and Miss Mapp knew, as if by a special revelation, that if she went, she would find that she made the 8th to complete 2 tables of bridge. When the butler opened the door, he would undoubtedly have in his hand a half-sheet of paper on which were written the names of the expected friends, and if the caller's name was not on that list, he would tell her with brazen impudence that neither Mrs. Poppet nor Miss Poppet were at home, while, before the baffled visitor had turned her back, he would admit another caller who duly appeared on his reference paper. So then the Poppets were giving a bridge party to which she had only been bidden at the last moment, clearly to take the place of some expected friend who had developed influenza, lost an aunt, or been obliged to go into London. Here, too, was the explanation of why, as she had overheard yesterday, Major Flint and Captain Puffin were only intending to play 1 round of golf today, and to come back by the 2:30 train. And why seek any further for the explanation of the lump of ice and the red currants, probably damaged, which she had observed Isabel purchase, and anyone could see, at least Miss Mapp could, why she had gone to the stationer's in the High Street just before. Packs of cards. Who the expected friend was who had disappointed Mrs. Poppet could be thought out later. At present, as Miss Mapp smiled at Withers and hummed her tune again, she had to settle whether she was going to be delighted to accept or obliged to decline. The argument in favor of being obliged to decline was obvious. Mrs. Poppet deserved to be served out for not including her among the original guests, and if she declined it was quite probable that at this late hour her hostess might not be able to get anyone else, and so one of her tables would be completely spoiled. In favor of accepting was the fact that she would get a rubber of bridge and a good tea, and would be able to say something disagreeable about the red Currant Fool, which would serve Miss Poppet out for attempting to crib her ancestral dishes. A bright, a joyous, a diabolical idea struck her, and she went herself to the telephone and genteelly wiped the place where Withers had probably breathed on it. "So kind of you, Isabel," she said, "but I am very busy today. And you didn't give me much notice, did you? So I'll try to look in if I can, shall I? I might be able to squeeze it in." There was a pause, and Miss Mapp knew that she had put Isabel in a hole. If she successfully tried to get somebody else, Miss Mapp might find she could squeeze it in, and there would be 9. If she failed to get someone else, and Miss Mapp couldn't squeeze it in, then there would be 7. Isabel wouldn't have a tranquil moment all day. "Ah, do squeeze it in," she said in those horrid wheedling tones which for some reason Major Flint found so attractive. That was one of the weak points about him, and there were many, many others. But that was among those which Miss Mapp found it difficult to condone. "If I possibly can," said Miss Mapp, "but at this late hour. Good-bye, dear, or only au reservoir, we hope." She heard Isabel's polite laugh at this nearly new and delicious malaprop before she rang off. Isabel collected malaprops and wrote them out in a notebook. If you reversed the notebook and began at the other end, you would find the collection of spoonerisms, which were very amusing too. Tea, followed by a bridge party, was in summer the chief manifestation of the spirit of hospitality in Tilling. Mrs. Poppet, it is true, had attempted to do something in the way of dinner parties, but though she was at liberty to give as many dinner parties as she pleased, nobody else had followed her ostentatious example. Dinner parties entailed a higher scale of living. Miss Mapp, for one, had accurately counted the cost of having 3 hungry people to dinner, and found that one such dinner party was not nearly compensated for, in the way of expense, by being invited to 3 subsequent dinner parties by your guests. Voluptuous teas were the rule, after which you really wanted no more than little bits of things, a cup of soup, a slice of cold tart, or a dished-up piece of fish and some toasted cheese. Then, after the excitement of bridge, and bridge was very exciting in Tilling, a jigsaw puzzle or patience cooled your brain and composed your nerves. In winter, however, with its scarcity of daylight, Tilling commonly gave evening bridge parties, and asked the requisite number of friends to drop in after dinner, though everybody knew that everybody else had only partaken of bits and things. Probably the ruinous price of coal had something to do with these evening bridge parties, for the fire that warmed your room when you were alone would warm all your guests as well, and then, when your hospitality was returned, you could let your sitting-room fire go out. But though Miss Mapp was already planning something in connection with Winter Bridge, winter was a long way off yet. Before Miss Mapp got back to her window in the garden-room, Mrs. Poppet's great offensive motor-car, which she always alluded to as the Royce, had come round the corner, and, stopping opposite Major Flint's house, was entirely extinguishing all survey of the street beyond. It was clear enough, then, that she had sent the Royce to take the two out to the golf-links, so that they should have time to play their round and catch the 2:20 back to Tilling again, so as to be in good time for the bridge party. Even as she looked, Major Flint came out of his house on one side of the Royce, and Captain Puffin on the other. The Royce obstructed their view of each other, and simultaneously each of them shouted across to the house of the other. Captain Puffin omitted a loud "Coo-ee, Major!" an Australian ejaculation learned on his voyages, while Major Flint bellowed "Kee-hee, Captain!" which, all the world knew, was of Oriental origin. The noise each of them made prevented him from hearing the other, and presently one, in a fuming hurry to start, ran round in front of the car at the precise moment that the other ran round behind it, and they both banged loudly on each other's knockers. These knocks were not so precisely simultaneous as the shouts had been, and this led to mutual discovery, hailed with peals of falsetto laughter on the part of Captain Puffin, and the more manly guffaws of the Major. After that, the Royce lumbered down the grass-grown cobbles of the street, and after a great deal of reversing managed to turn the corner. Miss Mapp set off with her basket to do her shopping. She carried in it the weekly books, which she would leave, with payment but not without argument, at the tradesmen's shops. There was an item for suet, which she intended to resist to the last breath in her body, though her butcher would probably surrender long before that. There was an item for eggs at the dairy, which she might have to pay, though it was a monstrous overcharge. She had made up her mind about the laundry. She intended to pay that bill with an icy countenance, and say, "Good morning for ever," or words to that effect, unless the proprietor instantly produced the article of clothing which had been lost in the wash, like King John's treasures, or refunded an ample sum for the replacing of it. All these quarrelsome errands were meat and drink to Miss Mapp. Tuesday morning, the day on which she paid and disputed her weekly bills, was as enjoyable as Sunday mornings when, sitting close under the pulpit, she noted the glaring inconsistencies and grammatical errors in the discourse. After the bills were paid and business was done, there was pleasure to follow, for there was a fitting on at the dressmaker's, the fitting on of a tea-gown to be worn at winter evening bridge parties, which, unless Miss Mapp was sadly mistaken, would astound and agonize by its magnificence all who set eyes on it. She had found the description of it, as worn by Mrs. Titus W. Trout, in an American fashion paper. It was of what was described as kingfisher blue, and had lumps and wedges of lace round the edge of the skirt, and orange chiffon round the neck. As she set off with her basket full of tradesmen's books, she pictured to herself with watering mouth the fury, the jealousy, the madness of envy which it would raise in all properly constituted breasts. In spite of her malignant curiosity and her cancerous suspicions about all her friends, in spite, too, of her restless activities, Miss Mapp was not, as might have been expected, a lady of lean and emaciated appearance. She was tall and portly, with plump hands, a broad, benignant face, and dimpled, well-nourished cheeks. An acute observer might have detected a danger warning in the sidelong glances of her rather bulgy eyes, and in a certain tightness at the corners of her expansive mouth, which boded ill for any who came within snapping distance, but to a more superficial view she was a rollicking, good-natured figure of a woman. Her mode of address, too, bore out this misleading impression. Nothing, for instance, could have been more genial just now than her telephone voice to Isabel Poppet, or her smile to Withers, even while she so strongly suspected her of using the telephone for her own base purposes, and as she passed along the High Street, she showered little smiles and bows on acquaintances and friends. She markedly drew back her lips in speaking, being in no way ashamed of her long white teeth, and wore a practically perpetual smile when there was the least chance of being under observation. Though at sermon time on Sunday, as has already been remarked, she greedily noted the weaknesses and errors of which those 20 minutes were so rewardingly full, she sat all the time with down-dropped eyes and a pretty, sacred smile on her lips, and now, when she spied on the other side of the street the figure of the vicar, she tripped slantingly across the road to him, as if by the move of a knight at chess, looking everywhere else, and only perceiving him with glad surprise at the very last moment. He was a great frequenter of tea-parties, and, except in Lent, an assiduous player of bridge, for a clergyman's duties, so he very properly held, were not confined to visiting the poor and exhorting the sinner. He should be a man of the world, and enter into the pleasures of his prosperous parishioners, as well as into the trials of the troubled. Being an accomplished card-player, he entered not only into their pleasures, but their pockets, and there was no lady of Tilling who was not pleased to have Mr. Bartlett for a partner. His winnings, so he said, he gave annually to charitable objects, though whether the charities he selected began at home was a point on which Miss Mapp had quite made up her mind. "Not a penny of that will the poor ever see," was the gist of her reflections when on disastrous days she paid him 7 and 9 pence. She always called him Padre, and had never actually caught him looking over his adversary's hands. "Good morning, Padre," she said as soon as she perceived him. "What a lovely day! The white butterflies were enjoying themselves so in the sunshine in my garden, and the swallows—" Miss Mapp, as every reader will have perceived, wanted to know whether he was playing bridge this afternoon at the Poppets. Major Flint and Captain Puffin certainly were, and it might be taken for granted that Godiva Plaistow was. With the Poppets and herself, that made 6. Mr. Bartlett was humorously archaic in speech. He interlarded archaism with Highland expressions, and his face was knobby, like a chest of drawers. "Ha, good morrow, fair dame," he said, "and prithee, art not thou even as ye white butterflies?" "Oh, Mr. Bartlett," said the fair dame with a provocative glance, "naughty, comparing me to a delicious butterfly." "Nay, prithee, why naughty?" said he. "Yea, indeed, it's a day to make ye little fowls rejoice. Ha! I perceive you are on the errands of the good wife Martha." And he pointed to the basket. "Yes, Tuesday morning," said Miss Mapp. "I pay all my household books on Tuesday. Poor but honest, dear Padre. What a rush life is to-day! I hardly know which way to turn. Little duties in all directions. And you're always busy. Such a busy bee." "Busy bee? Busy Bartlett," quoth she. "Yes, I'm a busy bee to-day, Mistress Mapp. Sermon all morning. Choir practice at 3. A baptism at 6. No time for a walk to-day, let alone a bit turn at the Gowf." Miss Mapp saw her opening, and made a busy bee-line for it. "Oh, but you should get regular exercise, Padre," said she. "You take no care of yourself. After the choir practice now, and before the baptism, you could have a brisk walk, to please me." "Yes, I had meant to get a breath of air then," said he. "But ye good Dame Poppet has insisted that I take a wee hand at the carts with them, the wifey and I. Prithee, shall we meet there?" "That makes 7 without me," thought Miss Mapp in parenthesis. Aloud she said, "If I can squeeze it in, Padre, I have promised dear Isabel to do my best." "Well, then a lassie can do no mair," said he. "Au reservoir, then." Miss Mapp was partly pleased, partly annoyed by the agility with which the Padre brought out her own particular joke. It was she who had brought it down to Tilling, and she felt she had an option on it at the end of every interview, if she meant, as she had done on this occasion, to bring it out. On the other hand, it was gratifying to see how popular it had become. She had heard it last month when on a visit to a friend at that sweet and refined village called Riseholme. It was rather looked down on there, as not being sufficiently intellectual. But within a week of Miss Mapp's return, Tilling rang with it, and she let it be understood that she was the original humorist. Godiva Plaistow came whizzing along the pavement, a short, stout, breathless body who might, so thought Miss Mapp, have acted up to the full and fell associations of her Christian name without exciting the smallest curiosity on the part of the crowd. Miss Mapp had much the same sort of figure, but her height, so she was perfectly satisfied to imagine, converted corpulence into majesty. The swift alternation of those Dutch-looking feet gave the impression that Mrs. Plaistow was going at a prodigious speed, but they could stop revolving without any warning, and then she stood still. Just when a collision with Miss Mapp seemed imminent, she came to a dead halt. It was as well to be quite certain that she was going to the Poppets, and Miss Mapp quite forgave and forgot about the worsted until she had found out. She could never quite manage the indelicacy of saying Godiva, whatever Mrs. Plaistow's figure and age might happen to be, but always addressed her as Diva, very affectionately, whenever they were on speaking terms. "What a lovely morning, Diva darling," she said, and noticing that Mr. Bartlett was well out of earshot, "the white butterflies were enjoying themselves so in the sunshine of my garden, and the swallows." Godiva was telegraphic in speech. "Lucky birds," she said. "No teeth. Beaks." Miss Mapp remembered her disappearance round the dentist's corner half an hour ago, and her own firm inference on the problem. "Toothache, darling," she said. "So sorry." "Wisdom," said Godiva. "Out at 1 o'clock. Gas. Ready for bridge this afternoon. Playing? Poppets." "If I can squeeze it in, dear," said Miss Mapp. "Such a hustle today." Diva put her hand to her face as wisdom gave her an awful twinge. Of course, she did not believe in the hustle, but her pangs prevented her from caring much. "Meet you then," she said. "Shall be all comfortable then. Oh—" This was more than could be borne, and Miss Mapp hastily interrupted. "Au reservoir, Diva dear," she said with extreme acerbity, and Diva's feet began swiftly revolving again. The problem about the bridge party thus seemed to be solved. The 2 Poppets, the 2 Bartletts, the Major and the Captain, with Diva darling and herself made 8, and Miss Mapp, with a sudden recrudescence of indignation against Isabel with regard to the red Currant Fool, and the belated invitation, made up her mind that she would not be able to squeeze it in, thus leaving the party 1 short. Even apart from the red Currant Fool, it served the Poppets right for not asking her originally. But only when, as seemed now perfectly clear, somebody else had disappointed them. But just as she emerged from the butcher's shop, having gained a complete victory in that matter of the suet, without expending the last breath in her body or anything like it, the whole of the seemingly solid structure came toppling to the ground. For on emerging, flushed with triumph, leaving the baffled butcher to try his tricks on somebody else if he chose but not on Miss Mapp, she ran straight into the disgrace of Tilling and her sex, the suffragette post-impressionist artist, who painted from the nude, both male and female, the socialist and the Germanophile, all incarnate in one frame. In spite of these execrable antecedents, it was quite in vain that Miss Mapp had tried to poison the collective mind of Tilling against this creature. If she hated anybody, and she undoubtedly did, she hated Irene Coles. The bitterest part of it all was that if Miss Coles was amused at anybody, and she undoubtedly was, she was amused at Miss Mapp. Miss Coles was strolling along in the attire to which Tilling generally had got accustomed, but Miss Mapp never. She had an old wide-awake hat jammed down on her head, a tall collar and stock, a large loose coat, knickerbockers, and grey stockings. In her mouth was a cigarette, in her hand she swung the orthodox wicker basket. She had certainly been to the other fishmongers at the end of the High Street, for a lobster, revived perhaps after a sojourn on the ice by this warm sun, which the butterflies and the swallows had been rejoicing in, was climbing with claws and waving legs over the edge of it. Irene removed her cigarette from her mouth and did something in the gutter which is usually associated with the floor of third-class smoking carriages. Then her handsome, boyish face, more boyish because her hair was closely clipped, broke into a broad grin. "Hello, Mapp," she said. "Been giving the tradesmen what for on Tuesday morning?" Miss Mapp found it extremely difficult to bear this obviously insolent form of address without a spasm of rage. Irene called her Mapp because she chose to, and Mapp, more bitterness, felt it wiser not to provoke coals. She had a dreadful, humorous tongue, an indecent disregard of public or private opinion, and her gift of mimicry was as appalling as her opinion about the Germans. Sometimes Miss Mapp alluded to her as quaint Irene, but that was as far as she got in the way of reprisals. "Oh, you sweet thing," she said, "treasure." Irene, in some ghastly way, seemed to take note of this. Why men like Captain Puffin and Major Flint found Irene fetching and killing was more than Miss Mapp could understand, or wanted to understand. Quaint Irene looked down at her basket. "Why, there's my lunch going over the top like those beastly British Tommies," she said. "Get back, love." Miss Mapp could not quite determine whether love was a sarcastic echo of treasure. It seemed probable. "Oh, what a dear little lobster," she said. "Look at his sweet claws." "I shall do more than look at them soon," said Irene, poking it into her basket again. "Come and have tiffin, Keehee. I've got to look after myself today." "What has happened to your devoted Lucy?" asked Miss Mapp. Irene lived in a very queer way with one gigantic maid, who, but for her sex, might have been in the Guards. "Ill. I suspect scarlet fever," said Irene. "Very infectious, isn't it? I was up nursing her all last night." Miss Mapp recoiled. She did not share Major Flint's robust views about microbes. "But I hope, dear, you've thoroughly disinfected—" "Oh, yes, soap and water," said Irene. "By the way, are you poppetting this afternoon?" "If I can squeeze it in," said Miss Mapp. "We'll meet again, then. Au reservoir," said Miss Mapp instantly. "No, not that silly old chestnut," said Irene. "I wasn't going to say that. I was only going to say, oh, do come to tiffin. You and me and the lobster. Then you and me. But it's a bore about Lucy. I was painting her. Fine figure, gorgeous legs. You wouldn't like to sit for me till she's well again." Miss Mapp gave a little squeal and bolted into her dressmaker's. She always felt battered after a conversation with Irene, and needed kingfisher blue to restore her. End of chapter 1.
Part 1 of Miss Mapp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Miss Mapp by E. F. Benson. Chapter 2, Part 1. There is not in all England a town so blatantly picturesque as Tilling, nor one, for the lover of level marshland, of tall reedy dykes, of enormous sunsets and rims of blue sea on the horizon, with so fortunate an environment. The hill on which it is built rises steeply from the level land, and, crowned by the great grave church so conveniently close to Miss Mapp's residence, positively consists of quaint corners, rough cast and timber cottages, and mellow Georgian fronts. Corners and quaintness, gems, glimpses and bits are an obsession to the artist, and in consequence, during the summer months, not only did the majority of its inhabitants turn out into the cobbled ways with sketching books, canvases, and paint boxes, but every morning brought into the town charabancs from neighbouring places, loaded with passengers, many of whom joined the artistic residents, and you would have thought, until an inspection of their productions convinced you of the contrary, that some tremendous outburst of art was rivalling the Italian Renaissance. For those who were capable of tackling straight lines and the intricacies of perspective, there were the steep, cobbled streets of charming and irregular architecture, while for those who rightly felt themselves colourists rather than architectural draftsmen, there was the view from the top of the hill over the marshes. There, but for one straight line to mark the horizon, and that could be easily misty, there were no petty conventionalities in the way of perspective, and the eager practitioner could almost instantly plunge into vivid greens and celestial blues, or at sunset into pinks and chromes and rose madder. Tourists who had no pictorial gifts would pick their way among the sketchers, and search the shops for cracked china and bits of brass. Few, if any of them, left without purchasing one of the famous Tilling money boxes, made in the shape of a pottery pig, who bore on his back that remarkable legend of his authenticity, which ran, "I won't be druv, though I am willing. Good morning, my love," said the Pig of Tilling. Miss Mapp had a long shelf full of these in every colour to adorn her dining room. The one which completed her collection, of a pleasant magenta colour, had only just been acquired. She called them "my sweet rainbow of piggies", and often, when she came down to breakfast, especially if Withers was in the room, she said, "Good morning, quaint little piggies." When Withers had left the room she counted them. The corner where the street took a turn toward the church, just below the window of her garden room, was easily the most popular stance for sketchers. You were bewildered and bowled over by bit. For the most accomplished of all there was that rarely attempted feat, the view of the steep downward street, which, in spite of all the efforts of the artists, insisted, in the sketch, on going uphill instead. Then, next in difficulty, was the street after it had turned, running by the gardener's cottage up to the churchyard and the church. This, in spite of its difficulty, was a very favourite subject, for it included, on the right of the street, just beyond Miss Mapp's garden wall, the famous crooked chimney, which was continually copied from every point of view. The expert artist would draw it rather more crooked than it really was, in order that there might be no question that he had not drawn it crooked by accident. This sketch was usually negotiated from the 3 steps in front of Miss Mapp's front door. Opposite the church and chimney artists would sit others, drawing the front door itself, difficult, and moistening their pencils at their cherry lips, while a little farther down the street was another battalion hard at work at the gabled front of the garden room and its picturesque bow. It was a favourite occupation of Miss Mapp's, when there was a decent gathering of artists outside, to pull a table right into the window of the garden room, in full view of them, and quite unconscious of their presence, to arrange flowers there with a smiling and pensive countenance. She had other little playful public pastimes. She would get her kitten from the house, and induce it to sit on the table while she diverted it with the tassel of the blind, and she would kiss it on its sweet little sooty head, or she would write letters in the window, or play Patience there, and then suddenly become aware that there was no end of ladies and gentlemen looking at her. Sometimes she would come out of the house, if the steps were very full, with her own sketching paraphernalia in her hands, and say, ever so coyly, "May I scriggle through?" or ask the squatters on her own steps if they could find a little corner for her. That was so interesting for them. They would remember afterwards that just while they were engaged on their sketches, the lady of that beautiful house at the corner, who had been playing with her kitten in the window, came out to sketch too. She addressed gracious and yet humble remarks to them. "I see you are painting my sweet little home. May I look? Oh, what a lovely little sketch!" Once, on a never-to-be-forgotten day, she observed one of them take a camera from his pocket and rapidly focus her as she stood on the top step. She turned full-faced and smiling to the camera just in time to catch the click of the shutter, but then it was too late to hide her face, and perhaps the picture might appear in the graphic or the sketch, or among the posturing nymphs of a neighbouring watering-place. This afternoon she was content to scriggle through the sketchers, and, humming a little tune, she passed up to the churchyard. Scriggle was one of her own words. Highly popular. It connoted squeezing and wiggling. There she carefully concealed herself under the boughs of the weeping ash tree directly opposite the famous south porch of the church. She had already drawn in the lines of this south porch on her sketching book, transferring them there by means of a tracing from a photograph, so that formed a very promising beginning to her sketch. But she was nicely placed, not only with regard to her sketch, for by peeping through the pretty foliage of the tree, she could command the front door of Mrs. Poppets, M.B.E., house. Miss Mapp's plans for the bridge party had, of course, been completely upset by the encounter with Irene in the High Street. Up till that moment she had imagined that, with the 2 ladies of the house and the Bartletts and the Major and the Captain and Godiva and herself, 2 complete tables of bridge would be formed, and she had therefore determined that she would not be able to squeeze the party into her numerous engagements, thereby spoiling the second table. But now everything was changed. There were 8 without her, and unless, at 3:45, she saw reason to suppose, by noting the arrivals at the house, that 3 bridge tables were in contemplation, she had made up her mind to squeeze it in, so that there would be 9 gamblers, and Isabel or her mother, if they had any sense of hospitality to their guests, would be compelled to sit out for ever and ever. Miss Mapp had been urgently invited, sweet Isabel had made a great point of her squeezing it in, and if sweet Isabel, in order to be certain of a company of 8, had asked quaint Irene as well, it would serve her right. An additional reason, besides this piece of good nature in managing to squeeze it in, for the sake of sweet Isabel, lay in the fact that she would be able to take some red Currant Fool, and after 1 spoonful exclaim, "Delicious!" and leave the rest uneaten. The white butterflies and the swallows were still enjoying themselves in the sunshine, and so too were the gnats, about whose pleasure, especially when they settled on her face, Miss Mapp did not care so much. But soon she quite ceased to regard them, for, before the quaint little gilded boys on each side of the clock, above the north porch, had hammered out the 3/4 after 3 on their bells, visitors began to arrive at the Poppets' door, and Miss Mapp was very active, looking through the boughs of the weeping ash, and sitting down again to smile and ponder over her sketch, with her head a little on one side, if anybody approached. One by one the expected guests presented themselves and were admitted: Major Flint and Captain Puffin, the Padre and his wife, darling Diva with her head muffled in a cloud, and finally Irene, still dressed as she had been in the morning, and probably reeking with scarlet fever. With the 2 Poppets these made 8 players, so as soon as Irene had gone in, Miss Mapp hastily put her sketching things away, and holding her admirably accurate drawing with its wash of sky not quite dry in her hand, hurried to the door, for it would never do to arrive after the 2 tables had started, since in that case it would be she who would have to sit out. Boone opened the door to her 3 staccato little knocks, and sulkily consulted his list. She duly appeared on it and was admitted. Having banged the door behind her, he crushed the list up in his hand and threw it into the fireplace. All those whose presence was desired had arrived, and Boone would turn his bovine eye on any subsequent caller and say that his mistress was out. "And may I put my sketching things down here, please, Boone?" said Miss Mapp ingratiatingly. "And will no one touch my drawing? It's a little wet still. The church porch." Boone made a grunting noise like the Tilling pig, and slouched away in front of her down the passage leading to the garden, sniffing. There they were, with the 2 bridge tables set out in a shady corner of the lawn, and a buffet vulgarly heaped with all sorts of dainty confections, which made Miss Mapp's mouth water, obliging her to swallow rapidly once or twice before she could manage a wide, dry smile. Isabel advanced. "Dee do, dear," said Miss Mapp. "Such a rush, but managed to squeeze it in, as you wouldn't let me off." "Oh, that was nice of you, Miss Mapp," said Isabel. A wild and awful surmise seized Miss Mapp. "And your dear mother?" she said. "Where is Mrs. Poppet?" "Mamma had to go to town this morning. She won't be back till close on dinner time." Miss Mapp's smile closed up like a furled umbrella. The trap had snapped behind her. It was impossible now to scriggle away. She had completed, instead of spoiling, the 2nd table. "So we're just 8," said Isabel, poking at her, so to speak, through the wires. "Shall we have a rubber first and then some tea? Or tea first? What says everybody?" Restless and hungry murmurs, like those heard at the sea lions' enclosure in the Zoological Gardens when feeding time approaches, seemed to indicate tea first, and with gallant greetings from the Major, and archaistic welcome from the Padre, Miss Mapp headed the general drifting movement towards the buffet. There may have been tea there, but there was certainly iced coffee and lager beer, and large jugs with dew on the outside, and vegetables floating in a bubbling liquid on the inside, and it was all so vulgar and opulent that with one accord everyone set to work in earnest, in order that the garden should present a less gross and greedy appearance. But there was no sign at present of the red Currant Fool, which was baffling. "And have you had a good game of golf, Major?" asked Miss Mapp, making the best of these miserable circumstances. "Such a lovely day. The white butterflies were enjoying—" She became aware that Diva and the Padre, who had already heard about the white butterflies, were in her immediate neighbourhood, and broke off. "Which have you beat? Or should I say won?" she asked. Major Flint's long moustache was dripping with lager beer, and he made a dexterous sucking movement. "Well, the Army and the Navy had it out," he said, "and if for once Britain's Navy was not invincible. Eh, Puffin?" Captain Puffin limped away pretending not to hear, and took his heaped plate and brimming glass in the direction of Irene. "But I'm sure Captain Puffin played quite beautifully too," said Miss Mapp in the vain attempt to detain him. She liked to collect all the men round her, and then scold them for not talking to the other ladies. "Well, a game's a game," said the Major. "It gets through the hours, Miss Mapp. Yes, we finished at the 14th hole, and hurried back to more congenial society. And what have you done to-day? Fairy errands, I'll be bound. Titania! Ha!" Suet errands, and errands about a missing article of underclothing, were really the most important things that Miss Mapp had done to-day, now that her bridge party scheme had so miscarried, but naturally she would not allude to these. "A little gardening," she said. "A little sketching. A little singing. Not time to change my frock and put on something less shabby. But I wouldn't have kept sweet Isabella's bridge party waiting for anything, and so I came straight from my painting here. Padre, I've been trying to draw the lovely south porch, but so difficult. I shall give up trying to draw, and just enjoy myself with looking. And there's your dear Evie. How do you do, Evie, love?" Godiva Plaistow had taken off her cloud for purposes of mastication, but wound it tightly round her head again as soon as she had eaten as much as she could manage. This had to be done on one side of her mouth, or with the front teeth in the nibbling manner of a rabbit. Everybody, of course, by now knew that she had had a wisdom tooth out at 1 p.m. with gas, and she could allude to it without explanation. "Dreamed I was playing bridge," she said, "and had a hand of aces. As I played, first it went off in my hand, all over. Blood. Hope it'll come true. Bar the blood." Miss Mapp found herself soon afterwards partnered with Major Flint and opposed by Irene and the Padre. They had hardly begun to consider their first hands when Boone staggered out into the garden under the weight of a large wooden bucket, packed with ice, that surrounded an interior cylinder. "Red Currant Fool at last," thought Miss Mapp, adding aloud, "Oh, poor little me, is it, to declare? Shall I say no trumps?" "Mustn't consult your partner, Mapp," said Irene, puffing at the end of her cigarette out its holder. Irene was painfully literal. "I don't, darling," said Miss Mapp, beginning to fizz a little. "No trumps. Not a trump. Not any sort of trump. There, what are we playing for, by the way?" "Bob 100," said the Padre, forgetting to be either Scotch or archaic. "Oh, gambler! You want the poor box to be the rich box, Padre," said Miss Mapp, surveying her magnificent hand with the greatest satisfaction. If it had not contained so many court cards she would have proposed playing for sixpence, not a shilling 100. All semblance of manners was invariably thrown to the winds by the ladies of Tilling when once bridge began. Primeval hatred took their place. The winners of any hand were exasperatingly condescending to the losers, and the losers correspondingly bitter and tremulous. Miss Mapp failed to get her contract, as her partner's contribution to success consisted of more twos and threes than were ever seen together before, and when quaint Irene, at the end, said, "Bad luck, Mapp," Miss Mapp's hands trembled so much with passion that she with difficulty marked the score. But she could command her voice sufficiently to say, "Lovely of you to be sympathetic, dear." Irene, in answer, gave a short, hoarse laugh, and dealed. By this time Boone had deposited at the left hand of each player a cup, containing a red, creamy fluid, on the surface of which bubbles intermittently appeared. Isabel, at this moment being dummy, had strolled across from the other table to see that everybody was comfortable, and provided with sustenance in times of stress, and here was clearly the proper opportunity for Miss Mapp to take a spoonful of this attempt at Red Currant Fool, and with a wry face, hastily, but not too hastily, smothered in smiles, to push the revolting compound away from her. But the one spoonful that she took was so delicious and exhilarating that she was positively unable to be good for Isabel. Instead, she drank her cup to the dregs in an absent manner, while considering how many trumps were out. The Red Currant Fool made a similarly agreeable impression on Major Flint. "'Pon my word," he said, "that's amazingly good. Cooling on a hot day like this. Full of champagne." Miss Mapp, seeing that it was so popular, had, of course, to claim it again as a family invention. "No, dear Major," she said, "there's no champagne in it. It's my Grandmamma Mapp's famous Red Currant Fool, with a little addition, perhaps, by me. No champagne. Yolk of egg and a little cream. Dear Isabel has got it very nearly right." The Padre had promised to take more tricks in diamonds than he had the slightest chance of doing. His mental worry communicated itself to his voice. "And why should there be nary a wee drap o' champagne in it?" said he, "though your Grandmamma Mapp did invent it. Weel, let's see your hand, partner. Ah, that's a sair sight." End of Chapter 2, Part 1. Of Miss Mapp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Miss Mapp by E. F. Benson. Chapter 2, Part 2. "And there'll be a sour wee score agin us when you're through with the playin' o' it," said Irene, in tones that could not be acquitted of a mocking intent. "Why the hallelujah did you go on when I didn't support you?" Even that one glass of Red Currant Fool, though there was no champagne in it, had produced, together with the certainty that her opponent had overbidden his hand, a pleasant exhilaration in Miss Mapp; but yolk of egg, as everybody knew, was a strong stimulant. Suddenly the name Red Currant Fool seemed very amusing to her. "Red Currant Fool," she said. "What a quaint, old-fashioned name! I shall invent some others. I shall tell my cook to make me some Gooseberry Idiot, or Strawberry Donkey. My play, I think. A ducky little ace of spades." "Ha, ha! Gooseberry idiot," said her partner. "Capital! You won't beat that in a hurry. And a two of spades on the top of it." "You wouldn't expect to find a two of spades at the bottom of it," said the Padre with singular acidity. The Major was quick to resent this kind of comment from a man, cloth or no cloth. "Well, by your leave, Bartlett, by your leave, I repeat," he said, "I shall expect to find twos of spades precisely where I please, and when I want your criticism—" Miss Mapp hastily intervened. "And after my wee ace, a little king piece," she said, "and if my partner doesn't play the queen to it, delicious, and I play just one more, yes, lovely, partner puts wee trumpy on it. I'm not surprised, it takes more than that to surprise me, and then Padre's got another spade I can find." "Hoots!" said the Padre with a temperate disgust. The hand proceeded for a round or two in silence, during which, by winks and gestures to Boone, the Major got hold of another cupful of red currant fool. There was already a heavy penalty of tricks against Miss Mapp's opponents, and after a moment's refreshment, the Major led a club, of which at this period Miss Mapp seemed to have none. She felt happier than she had been ever since, trying to spoil Isabella's second table, she had only succeeded in completing it. "Little trumpy again," she said, putting it on with the lightness of one of the white butterflies and turning the trick. "Useful little trumpy." She broke off suddenly from the chant of victory which ladies of Tilling were accustomed to indulge in during cross-roughs, for she discovered in her hand another more than useless little clubby. The silence that succeeded became tense in quality. Miss Mapp knew she had revoked and squeezed her brains to think how she could possibly dispose of the card, while there was a certain calmness about the Padre, which but too clearly indicated that he was quite content to wait for the inevitable disclosure. This came at the last trick, and though Miss Mapp made one forlorn attempt to thrust the horrible little clubby underneath the other cards and gather them up, the Padre pounced upon it. "What ho, fair lady!" he said, now completely restored. "Methinks thou art forsworn. Let me have a keek at the last trick but three. Verily, I wus that thou didst trump ye club aforetime. I said so. There it is. Ah, that's bonny for us, partner." Miss Mapp, of course, denied it all, and a ruthless reconstruction of the tricks took place. The Major, still busy with red currant fool, was the last to grasp the disaster, and then instantly deplored the unsportsmanlike greed of his adversaries. "Well, I should have thought, in a friendly game like this," he said. "Of course you're within your right, Bartlett. Might is right, eh? But upon my word, a pound of flesh, you know. Can't think what made you do it, partner." "You never asked me if I had any more clubs," said Miss Mapp shrilly, giving up for the moment the contention that she had not revoked. "I always ask if my partner has no more of a suit, and I always maintain that a revoke is more the partner's fault than the player's. Of course, if our adversaries claim it—" "Naturally we do, Mapp," said Irene. "You were down on me sharp enough the other day." Miss Mapp wrinkled her face up into the sweetest and extremest smile of which her mobile features were capable. "Darling, you won't mind my telling you that just at this moment you are being dummy," she said, "and so you mustn't speak a single word. Otherwise there is no revoke, even if there was at all, which I consider far from proved yet." There was no further proof possible beyond the clear and final evidence of the cards, and since everybody, including Miss Mapp herself, was perfectly aware that she had revoked, their opponents merely marked up the penalty and the game proceeded. Miss Mapp, of course, following the rule of correct behaviour after revoking, stiffened into a state of offended dignity, and was extremely polite and distant with partner and adversaries alike. This demeanour became even more majestic when, in the next hand, the Major led out of turn. The moment he had done it, Miss Mapp hurriedly threw a random card out of her hand on the table, in the hope that Irene, by some strange aberration, would think she had led first. "Wait a second," she said. "I call a lead. Give me a trump, please." Suddenly the awful expression as of some outraged empress faded from Miss Mapp's face, and she gave a little shriek of laughter which sounded like a squeaking slate pencil. "Haven't got one, dear," she said. "Now may I have your permission to lead what I think best? Thank you." There now existed between the four players that state of violent animosity which was the usual atmosphere towards the end of a rubber. But it would have been a capital mistake to suppose that they were not all enjoying themselves immensely. Emotion is the salt of life, and here was no end of salt. Every one was overbidding his hand, and the penalty tricks were a glorious cause of vituperation, scarcely veiled, between the partners who had failed to make good, and caused epidemics of condescending sympathy from the adversaries, which produced a passion in the losers far keener than their fury at having lost. What made the concluding stages of this contest more exciting was that an evening breeze suddenly arising, just as a deal was ended, made the cards rise in the air like a covey of partridges. They were recaptured, and all the hands were found to be complete, with the exception of Miss Mapp's, which had a card missing. This, an ace of hearts, was discovered by the Padre, face upwards in a bed of mignonette, and he was vehement in claiming a fresh deal, on the grounds that the card was exposed. Miss Mapp could not speak at all in answer to this preposterous claim. She could only smile at him, and proceed to declare trumps as if nothing had happened. The Major alone failed to come up to the full measure of these enjoyments, for though all the rest of them were as angry with him as they were with each other, he remained in a most indecorous state of good humour, drinking thirstily of the red Currant Fool, and when he was dummy, quite failing to mind whether Miss Mapp got her contract or not. Captain Puffin, at the other table, seemed to be behaving with the same impropriety, for the sound of his shrill, falsetto laugh was as regular as his visits to the bucket of red Currant Fool. What if there was champagne in it, after all? So Miss Mapp luridly conjectured. What if this unseemly good humour was due to incipient intoxication? She took a little more of that delicious decoction herself. It was almost unanimously determined, when the two rubbers came to an end almost simultaneously, that as everything was so pleasant and agreeable, there should be no fresh sorting of the players. Besides, the second table was only playing stakes of 6d. a hundred, and it would be very awkward and unsettling that any one should play these moderate points in one rubber, and those high ones the next. But at this point Miss Mapp's table was obliged to endure a pause, for the Padre had to hurry away just before 6 to administer the rite of baptism in the church, which was so conveniently close. The Major afforded a good deal of amusement, as soon as he was out of hearing, by hoping that he would not baptize the child the Knave of Hearts if it was a boy, or if a girl the Queen of Spades, but in order to spare the susceptibilities of Mrs. Bartlett, this admirable joke was not communicated to the next table, but enjoyed privately. The author of it, however, made a note in his mind to tell it to Captain Puffin, in the hopes that it would cause him to forget his ruinous half-crown defeat at golf this morning. Quite as agreeable was the arrival of a fresh supply of red Currant Fool, and as this had been heralded a few minutes before by a loud pop from the butler's pantry, which looked on to the lawn, Miss Mapp began to waver in her belief that there was no champagne in it, particularly as it would not have suited the theory by which she accounted for the Major's unwonted good humour, and her suggestion that the pop they had all heard clearly was the opening of a bottle of stone ginger beer was not delivered with conviction. To make sure, however, she took one more sip of the new supply, and, irradiated with smiles, made a great concession. "I believe I was wrong," she said. "There is something in it beyond yolk of egg and cream. Oh, there's Boone. He will tell us." She made a seductive face at Boone, and beckoned to him. "Boone, will you think it very inquisitive of me," she asked archly, "if I ask whether you have put a teeny drop of champagne into this delicious red Currant Fool?" "A bottle and a half, miss," said Boone morosely, "and half a pint of old brandy. Will you have some more, miss?" Miss Mapp curbed her indignation at this vulgar squandering of precious liquids, so characteristic of Poppets. She gave a shrill little laugh. "Oh, no, thank you, Boone," she said. "I mustn't have any more. Delicious, though." Major Flint let Boone fill his cup while he was not looking. "And we owe this to your grandmother, Miss Mapp?" he asked gallantly. "That's a second debt." Miss Mapp acknowledged this polite subtlety with reservation. "But not the champagne in it, Major," she said. "Grandmamma Nap—" The Major beat his thigh in ecstasy. "Ha! That's a good Spoonerism for Miss Isabel's books," he said. "Miss Isabel, we've got a new—" Miss Mapp was very much puzzled at the slight confusion in her speech, for her utterance was usually remarkably distinct. There might be some little joke made at her expense on the effect of Grandmamma Mapp's invention if this lovely Spoonerism was published. But if she, who had only just tasted the red Currant Fool, tripped in her speech, how amply were Major Flint's good nature and Captain Puffin's incessant laugh accounted for. She herself felt very good-natured too. How pleasant it all was. "Oh, naughty," she said to the Major. "Pray hush. You're disturbing them at their rubber. And here's the Padre back again." The new rubber had only just begun. Indeed, it was lucky that they had cut their cards without any delay, when Mrs. Poppet appeared on her return from her expedition to London. Miss Mapp begged her to take her hand, and instantly began playing. "It would really be a kindness to me, Mrs. Poppet," she said. "No diamonds at all, partner? But of course, if you won't, you've been missing such a lovely party. So much enjoyment." Suddenly she saw that Mrs. Poppet was wearing on her ample breast a small piece of ribbon with a little cross attached to it. Her entire stock of good humour vanished, and she smiled her widest. "We needn't ask you what took you to London," she said. "Congratulations! How was the dear king?" This rubber was soon over, and even as they were adding up the score, there arose a shrill outcry from the next table, where Mrs. Plaistow, as usual, had made the tale of her winning sixpence in excess of what everybody else considered was due to her. The sound of that was so familiar that nobody looked up or asked what was going on. "Darling Diva and her bobbies, Padre," said Miss Mapp in an aside. "So modest in her demands. Oh, she's stopped. Somebody has given her sixpence. Not another rubber? Well, perhaps it is rather late, and I must say good night to my flowers before they close up for the night. Are these shillings mine? Fancy!" Miss Mapp was seething with excitement, curiosity, and rage, as with Major Flint on one side of her and Captain Puffin on the other, she was escorted home. The excitement was due to her winnings, the rage to Mrs. Poppet's order, the curiosity to the clue she believed she had found to those inexplicable lights that burned so late in the houses of her companions. Certainly, it seemed that Major Flint was trying not to step on the joints of the paving stones, and succeeding very imperfectly, while Captain Puffin, on her left, was walking very unevenly on the cobbles. Even making due allowance for the difficulty of walking evenly there at any time, Miss Mapp could not help thinking that a teetotaler would have made a better job of it than that. Both gentlemen talked at once, very agreeably but very carefully, Major Flint promising himself a studious evening over some very interesting entries in his Indian diary, while Captain Puffin anticipated the speedy solution of that problem about the Roman road which had puzzled him so long. As they said their au revoirs to her on the doorstep, they took off their hats more often than politeness really demanded. Once in her house, Miss Mapp postponed her good nights to her sweet flowers, and hurried with the utmost speed of which she was capable to her garden room, in order to see what her companions were doing. They were standing in the middle of the street, and Major Flint, with gesticulating forefinger, was being very impressive over something. Interesting as was Miss Mapp's walk home, and painful as was the light which it had conceivably thrown on the problem that had baffled her for so long, she might have been more acutely disgusted had she lingered on with the rest of the bridge party in Mrs. Poppet's garden, so revolting was the sycophantic loyalty of the newly decorated member of the British Empire. She described minutely her arrival at the palace, her momentary nervousness as she entered the throne-room, the instantaneousness with which all that vanished when she came face to face with her sovereign. "I assure you, he gave the most gracious smile," said she, "just as if we had known each other all our lives, and I felt at home at once. And he said a few words to me. Such a beautiful voice he has. Dear Isabel, I wish you had been there to hear it, and then—" "Oh, mamma, what did he say?" asked Isabel, to the great relief of Mrs. Plaistow and the Bartletts, for while they were bursting with eagerness to know with the utmost detail all that had taken place, the correct attitude in Tilling was profound indifference to anybody of whatever degree who did not live at Tilling, and to anything that did not happen there. In particular, any manifestation of interest in kings or other distinguished people was held to be a very miserable failing. So they all pretended to look about them, and take no notice of what Mrs. Poppet was saying, and you might have heard a pin drop. Diva silently and hastily unwound her cloud from over her ears, risking catching cold in the hole where her tooth had been, so terrified was she of missing a single syllable. "Well, it was very gratifying," said Mrs. Poppet. "He whispered to some gentleman standing near him, who I think was the Lord Chamberlain, and then told me how interested he had been in the good work of the Tilling Hospital, and how especially glad he was to be able, and just then he began to pin my order on, to be able to recognise it. Now I call that wonderful to know all about the Tilling Hospital. And such neat, quick fingers he has, I am sure it would take me double the time to make a safety pin hold, and then he gave me another smile, and passed me on, so to speak, to the Queen, who stood next to him, and who had been listening to all he had said." "And did she speak to you too?" asked Diva, quite unable to maintain the right indifference. "Indeed she did. She said, 'So pleased,' and what she put into those words I'm sure I can never convey to you. I hear how sincere they were. It was no set form of words, as if she meant nothing by it. She was pleased. She was just as interested in what I had done for the Tilling Hospital as the King was. And the crowds outside, they lined the mall for at least 50 yards. I was bowing and smiling on this side and that till I felt quite dizzy." "And was the Prince of Wales there?" asked Diva, beginning to wind her head up again. She did not care about the crowds. "No, he wasn't there," said Mrs. Poppit, determined to have no embroidery in her story, however much other people, especially Miss Mapp, decorated remarkable incidents until you hardly recognised them. "He wasn't there. I dare say something had unexpectedly detained him, though I shouldn't wonder if before long we all saw him. For I noticed in the evening paper, which I was reading on the way down here, after I'd seen the King, that he was going to stay with Lord Ardingly for this very next week-end, and what's the station for Ardingly Park if it isn't Tilling? Though it's quite a private visit, I feel convinced that the right and proper thing for me to do is to be at the station, or at any rate just outside with my order on." "I shall not claim acquaintance with him, or anything of that kind," said Mrs. Poppit, fingering her order, "but after my reception to-day at the Palace, nothing can be more likely than that His Majesty might mention, quite casually of course, to the Prince that he had just given a decoration to Mrs. Poppit of Tilling. And it would make me feel very awkward to think that had happened, and I was not somewhere about to make my curtsy." "Oh, mamma, may I stand by you, or behind you?" asked Isabel, completely dazzled by the splendour of this prospect and prancing about the lawn. This was quite awful. It was as bad as, if not worse than, the historically disastrous remark about super tax, and a general rigidity, as if of some partial cataleptic seizure, froze Mrs. Poppit's guests, rendering them, like incomplete Marconi installations, capable of receiving but not of transmitting. They received these impressions, but they also continued, mechanically, to receive more chocolates and sandwiches, and such refreshments as remained on the buffet, but no one could intervene and stop Mrs. Poppit from exposing herself further. One reason for this, of course, as already indicated, was that they all longed for her to expose herself as much as she possibly could, for if there was a quality, and indeed there were many, on which Tilling prided itself, it was its immunity from snobbishness. There were, no doubt, in the great world with which Tilling concerned itself so little, kings and queens and dukes and members of the Order of the British Empire, but every Tillingite knew that he or she, particularly she, was just as good as any of them, and indeed better, being more fortunate than they in living in Tilling. And if there was a process in the world which Tilling detested, it was being patronised, and there was this woman telling them all what she felt it right and proper for her, as Mrs. Poppit of Tilling, M.B.E., to do, when the heir apparent should pass through the town on Saturday. The rest of them, Mrs. Poppit implied, might do what they liked, for they did not matter, but she must put on her order and make her curtsy. And Isabel, by her express desire to stand beside, or even behind, her mother for this degrading moment, had shown of what stock she came. End of Chapter 2, Part 2.